So, do you ever think to yourself that everybody else seems to be going mental? Woodworkers typically engineers, and you do expect them all, rationally speaking, to understand engineering principles. So, this entire debate about end grain glue joints being stronger than side grain glue joints is slightly crazy, but so far I've watched Wood Whisperer and I've watched Stumpy Nud's responses to the original guy's scientific video. Now, I'm not being harsh to anyone in particular. The actual test scenario that was used was, largely speaking, scientific, but it was flawed. It was very fundamentally flawed from an engineering standpoint. As Stumpy Nubs points out quite rightly, that was a video proving that glue is stronger than lignum, and that's all it proved. That is what it proved. As Spagnolo points out, and then Stumpy Nubs also points out later on in his video as well, that the use of glue in structural engineered joints is useful, but it is the structural engineering of the joint that provides the strength. But where the original video, by whatever his name is, I can't even remember his name now, I'd never heard of him before, that people seem to be grasping hold of, has missed the entire principle. Now, whilst Stumpy does say quite clearly that the glue is stronger than the lignum, and that video, and the video, the scientific video, does very successfully represent that. I'm not going to bother linking to any videos or making a fancy video about it. I'm just going to rant with my face. It's the same principal problem as when Peter Millard made a step stool type test out of MDF glued and not screwed. And this goes all the way back to Gosforth Handyman insisting that making bookcases with biscuits is sufficiently strong, and then Keith from Rag and Bone Brown doing a test for the strength of those joints. Right. If you have a surface that's glued together like that, end to end, and you put a weight on it, okay, it probably won't break. It might not break, even when you've got one like that. But if you stress that joint in the way that was done in the original video that everyone's debating at the moment, to the point where one breaks but the other one doesn't, remember that amount of weight. I think, what was it, turning up to be like 200 kilograms or something stupid like that. I can't remember what the actual numbers were, but something like that. And maybe it was more like 100 kilograms. Right, but if you take that 100 kilogram weight, divide it in half, and drop that weight from 3-4 meters above it, so, it's not going to break either joint. When that lands, the side grain to end grain joint will probably break. The end grain joint to end grain joint will probably break. The side grain to side grain joint will probably not break. This is the point of the engineering side of woodwork and glue, which everyone seems to have missed. When you've got a car and it has crumple zones in the front, that is in order to reduce the speed, increase the time, and reduce the speed over an increased amount of time, and therefore reduce the final force that the passenger feels when they finally reach full deceleration. If you were to plot a curve, I'm not going to make a fancy video, but if you were to plot a curve of speed change over time, so speed over time would do that, or actually it'd do that if you're looking at it the correct way around. Right, the area, beg pardon, not area, gradient. Underneath that graph would be the total force exerted, okay? If you didn't have those crumple zones and the deceleration happens a lot faster, right, then the actual force involved is an awful lot higher, because like the initial force that hits, the actual acceleration or deceleration that hits is a lot higher. Now, how you've got in your side grain to side grain joints is the elasticity of the wood. Your question as to whether or not something is strong is not whether or not it can withstand stress, in terms of wood engineering at least, because we're not working with metal. Your question is whether or not it will withstand use over 20 years. So if you had, for example, a bed and you glued your cleat, for your slats underneath the mattress, you glued your cleat side grain to side grain versus another version, which was end grain to end grain, all the way along, and then you jumped onto the bed, the side grain to side grain joint would not fail, but the end grain to side grain joints would fail, because the force of which the deceleration of my mass as I land on the bed is absorbed by the lignum in between the joints. And therefore the total force, the actual peak force, which would have been demonstrated in terms of stress in the bottle jack experiment, is way higher in end grain to side grain joint, because one or the other joint is not flexible, is not able to bend, is not able to, using elastic properties, deform and then reform. So if you make a step stool, as Peter Millard's video shows him standing on, well, actually, I think it's a bedside table. He gets up and he stands on it very slowly, very gingerly, and it takes his weight. It takes his weight over and over and over again. But then, right at the end of the video, he stamps on it with not a lot of force, and it completely fails catastrophically. Now, which of those two joints was stronger? It's exactly the same joint, but in a different use case. In circumstances where you are literally just going to gently push against something and increase that force, yes, end grain to end grain joints are stronger because it is the glue that breaks first. But in situations where you're going to hit it, then side grain to side grain is way stronger. That is not actually the end of the story, however, because you also have side grain to side grain, the means by which the glue actually seeps into the material. Now, end grain to end grain, okay, you will have, everyone knows about the straws analogy. End grain to end grain, you will have a film of glue in between the two, and you will have lumps poking through, as that video showed quite successfully, going into the certain pores. But what it can't particularly show very well is why the lignum breaks before the glue is not because, well, it is because it's stronger, but the lignum is always going to break before the glue, because the actual glue joint between side grain to side grain is substantially stronger than end grain to end grain, because it wraps around those straws. It goes into the wood, it seeps into the wood, actually permeates inside the wood and wraps around the straws, creating an entire hold. So where the lignum is, it will seep into and around that. And to break that joint is a lot harder than to break it literally just poking a couple of, maybe even half a mil into a pore. Unfortunately, your man's testing doesn't test for that, doesn't actually look into that. And I'm really hoping that that is looked into, because currently there's a lot of people raving about how end grain to end grain is stronger than side grain to side grain, and that is categorically false, except in the unique circumstance of granularly applied stress, which is nowhere near comparable to how the actual product is going to be used. If you sit down too quickly on a chair and it is end grain to end grain, it will explode when you sit on it. Well, it will fail catastrophically. Not explode, but you know what I mean. Whereas if it's side grain to side grain and you sit down on it quickly, it will absorb your fat, weight, and then it will spring back up again. It will slow down over a period of time. Rather than hit just shock, it will slow down, and the peak force will not overcome the glue or the lignin. That is why side grain to side grain is stronger. I wish I could be bothered to make a better video about this. I also wish I could be bothered to make a video about why Steve Mould is wrong about the chain fountain, but I can't. Anyway, further questions, direct them to the people that are actually making money out of YouTube, because I'm going to be doing it as a hobby. I've got like 4 years worth of footage, but no videos actually made. All right, take it easy.